Hi everyone. This video is going to be super quick. I don't normally do these, but because this issue is so weird and complicated, it actually needs a video to be explained. I'll try and keep it brief, but please try and stay with me. This is pretty important. Yesterday at Joe Biden's climate summit thing, Scott Morrison presented his ambitions for climate change, of course, none of which are actual ambitions. And what I was really interested in is the background of how he did it. How did he get the stats that he used? So before we get into what he said, I need to explain something important about how Australia does its emissions accounting. So what you can see here on this image is where the emissions responsibility lies for the stuff that flows into Australia and out of Australia. So Australia sells a lot of fossil fuels to other countries. And it also imports stuff into the country. So, your laptop is made in a particular country and it takes emissions to make that laptop, and then the laptop is shipped on a boat to Australia. Now, the emissions from making that laptop are counted in the country where the laptop is made. Same thing for the fossil fuels that Australia digs from the ground, it processes, and it ships to another country. So that's mostly coal and gas. That is slightly different, of course. Australia exports fossil fuels, not laptops. And fossil fuels, you burn them and they create emissions, not just when in the process of digging them up, but when they're burned too. So currently the emissions created when you actually use those products, those fossil fuels, they're counted in the countries they're shipped to as well. We're not going to talk about that because, it's a pretty big issue, but we're going to talk about what happens when products are made. Both fossil fuels and the stuff that gets into Australia. So as you can see here, the history of Australia's emissions is not particularly great. From 2005 to about 2007, there was sort of flatlining. Between 2007 and about 2013, they were decreasing. And then from then on, there has been a decrease, but it's been very slight compared to the previous period. Obviously, this is political. The current government, the Conservative Liberal National Coalition, does not really like reducing emissions very much. And of course, when they're in power, emissions tend to either flatline or rise. And the centre-left Labor Party, in partnership with the Greens Party, when they were in power, they actually implemented a bunch of policies that effectively reduced emissions during that time. So that's pretty important. So what we actually see is underneath that flat line over the past, sort of 7-8 years or so in Australia is a tug of war. Renewable energy has actually been decreasing emissions in Australia because it's been growing in the electricity grid and it's been displacing fossil fuels. This is a really good thing. And as you can see in this chart, the green chunks underneath the line are year-on-year changes where there's been a reduction in emissions by sector. Renewables have been decreasing emissions, of course, which is really good from the electricity sector. Unfortunately, agriculture was decreasing emissions too due to a drought, not due to any systemic changes. That's not a good thing. But what we can see is actually balancing that out has been increases in emissions from fugitive emissions, from transport, and from stationary energy. Of those sectors, a pretty big chunk is from an expansion of the mining sector in Australia. That's stuff that's mined to be transported mostly overseas. This is coal and gas. Australia digs up fossil fuels and it sells them to the world. The process of digging it up and processing it is very emissions intensive. So those emissions count towards Australia's emissions in terms of the way current global accounting of emissions is done. So I've just highlighted fugitive emissions there on this chart, just to give you an idea. The fugitive emissions are the methane that's released from the ground when you either extract coal or gas. Most people associate it with gas, but actually there's a pretty decent chunk from coal mining too. And it's the clearest signal. There's a lot of emissions from mining mixed in with those other sectors, but fugitive emissions show us the clearest signal here. You can see it expanding quite rapidly after sort of around 2015-ish. So that's the way emissions currently work in Australia, right? The green line on this chart is the emissions that happen when Australia digs up fossil fuels and prepares them to be sold overseas. And that green line is counted. Emissions from exporting fossil fuels are counted in Australia. The orange line on this chart are the emissions from making that laptop in another country and then shipping it over to Australia. Obviously, it's not just laptops, it's a whole bunch of stuff. they are not currently counted. There's a new type of way of thinking about emissions that switches this around. So what happens is the emissions from making the product that goes overseas actually lie with the country that receives the product. So obviously Australia sells a lot of emissions intensive stuff, and the stuff it receives has lower emissions. So if you use that accounting method, Australia's emissions are lower. So this is what happens. I've done some animations in PowerPoint. I'm sorry. Whee! There it goes. So Australia does actually still bear some responsibility for emissions, but the net impact is lower by inverting the responsibility for imports and exports for Australia. So this gets switched around too. The green line, the stuff Australia exports, the emissions related to the stuff Australia exports is not counted, and the stuff that Australia imports is counted. This is called consumption, the consumption method. And for Australia, emissions are slightly lower. It's controversial. It's not particularly agreed upon. Some countries, it's beneficial to do accounting like this. In other countries, it's definitely not, which means everyone has a different view about it. In the end, of course, it doesn't really matter. The important thing for emissions is that they happen. The atmosphere does not give a crap about where it sits on spreadsheets. So this is really a geopolitical question, which of course brings us to the geopolitical thing that happened quite recently at the Biden Climate Summit. Scott Morrison was talking about the change from 2005 for Australia's emissions. As I showed you previously, there was a big drop during the period of the Labor government, and after that, a very small drop during the period of the Liberal National Coalition. Scott Morrison talks about a 19% drop. The vast majority of that occurred during the Labor government. The rest of it has been due either to the growth of renewable energy underneath the Labor government policy, of course, and the impacts of COVID-19 over the year 2020, which is another sort of 2 or 3%. So that is already not a particularly informative piece of information. But what happened is he started talking here about 36% reductions when you exclude exports. So my immediate thought was, oh, okay, he's talking about consumption emissions here. That's, to remind you, that's when you take the emissions from stuff that's being exported and you discount that, and you take the emissions from stuff you're bringing into Australia and you count that under your own ledger. And that was included in the emissions projections from the government's Environment Department in the year 2020. And I was reading it and I was like, huh, that's a bit weird. I wonder why they've included that. But I checked the percentage changes for both the regular method of accounting for emissions and the consumption method, where you invert those two responsibilities. And for 2020, it was actually 23%, not 36%. And I was like, huh, okay, that's weird. What's going on here? Because those numbers don't match. He's talking about 36%, and I don't know how he got it. So I thought I would check something. I was pretty confident that Scott Morrison, or whoever came up with this figure, presumably somebody in Angus Taylor's office, wouldn't be so brazen as to do this. But it turns out that what happened is they only did half of the process. So they took the emissions responsibility for making fossil fuels, and they transferred it to another country, but they left the emissions responsibility for stuff that's imported into Australia with the people manufacturing it. There it goes. It just stays there, which means that Australia is left with no responsibility for emissions whatsoever, except for the stuff that is made in Australia and used in Australia. This is far, far beyond a controversial accounting method. This is just a completely ludicrous and totally silly way of doing emissions calculations. Of course, every single other country in the world would not be willing to take on all of the responsibility for this style of emissions accounting. It's really, really silly. And I'm not sure if you followed on Twitter what was happening when these numbers started coming out, but people on climate and energy Twitter were completely baffled and quite rightly infuriated by this, because it is just taking all of the responsibility and shoving it on the rest of the world. It's really, really gross. And I'm quite shocked that this is something that was a tent-pole figure in Scott Morrison's climate speech that he gave in front of the entire world, I guess for the duration that he was actually speaking, considering his Zoom mic was muted for the first half of the speech. So the Morrison method is in red on this chart. This is where you take all of the responsibility for exporting products overseas, in Australia's case, fossil fuels, and you don't take on any responsibility for the imported emissions for the stuff that you bring into the country. It brings down emissions by about half. So, this is really, really significant. Australia's emissions change very, very dramatically when you use the Morrison method. And of course, when you convert it into a percentage, then you can see exactly where this number came from. In 2019, Morrison method emissions were 36% of emissions in 2005. Of course, that percentage is different between all the different methods because Australia has been exporting more and more fossil fuels. It's been growing as a proportion of the total exports, of the total emissions in Australia since 2005. So if you just cut it out and you don't do any balancing act to counterbalance it with the stuff you're bringing into the country, of course, the change is really, really dramatic. And for Scott Morrison to wheel this out again on the global stage is just so, so wild to me that I just can't handle it. I was losing my mind when I was when I was watching this play out. And when I was doing these spreadsheets, I just couldn't believe that this is what he did. And on reflection, of course, it's not that surprising. This is something that has happened before. Australia was actually forecasted to be very, very badly off track to meet its 2030 Paris targets. That is a 26 to 28% reduction on 2005 levels. Not a particularly dramatic change, but Australia's emissions were so bad, a couple of years ago that the projections were saying Australia's just going to miss it. There's just no chance. There's no hope. And so what the government did is they took what they called carryover, that's overperformance, what they described as overperformance on previous climate targets, and they just took it and they applied it to the Paris climate target. That's not how this works. It's the equivalent of saying, well, only 2 people died from COVID in the previous month. And so our target was 10 people dying. So we're going to take those 8 people, we're going to carry over into this month, and we're going to slow down vaccination, and we're going to stop restricting movement across our cities and allow a further 8 people to die because, we're carrying over the credits from that previous thing. The goal is to reduce emissions as much as possible in every single period. It's not really an accounting game. It is, of course, a physical, real game where people die, people get hurt, and you need to reduce emissions as much as possible. So what the government was trying to do with the Kyoto carryover thing was trying to essentially take their inaction, take their failure to reduce emissions and try and frame it as action, try and twist spreadsheets around instead of actually reducing emissions. It would, of course, be a lot easier and a lot simpler if they took all the effort they put into trying to fake emissions reductions and just reduced emissions instead. It's actually nowhere near as hard as people believe it is. There are a lot of countries around the world who have been far more successful than even they expected. And of course, the added benefit is that first of all, you get cleaner cities, you get less air pollution, you get greater investment, greater jobs, but of course you also reduce emissions. So it would be a pretty good thing to do. And then, of course, on top of that, I really just have to mention that Australia's 2030 Paris targets of 26 to 28% are really, really badly insufficient. So, of course, what we saw at the Biden Climate Summit is the US, Canada, and Japan all increased their climate ambitions quite significantly. The UK had previously announced it the day before, but they increased their climate ambitions. They locked a 78% by 2035 reduction. Of course, the baseline is a different year, but it's very, very significant. All 4 countries have very significantly greater levels of ambition compared to Australia. Japan is a really notable one, of course, because the vast majority of the fossil fuels that Australia sells to the world are going to Asian countries, and Japan is a major chunk. The last time I checked, it was, I think, between 40 to 50% of all fossil fuel revenue that Australia is sending overseas is going to Japan. And they are accelerating their climate ambitions. They're getting rid of coal and gas in their system, hopefully pretty soon. And that is going to, of course, affect all of the things that I've just described to you. So I hope that helps you understand exactly what's going on here. This is a really complicated and confusing thing, but I think it's actually really important because this is really the next iteration of the government's effort to fabricate climate action. This is something that has real consequences, of course, because then it deflects pressure to actually increase climate ambition in a real way and reduce emissions in a real way. And as you can see from this chart, to align with a 1.5 degree target, Australia should be setting around a 66% target for emissions reductions compared to 2005 levels. By the year 2030, it's all doable. This is all really straightforward. There's a really good report by the group called Climate Action Tracker called Scaling Up Australia, and it details the changes that need to happen in every single sector. And they're all beneficial changes. This is something that everyone can participate in. It increases jobs, it increases local benefits to the communities that are hosting all of the technologies that are required for this. So I hope that explains it, and thank you for listening.